sharing her perspective. No, Silvia, sorry, who will be sharing your perspective on the support to. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. So thank you for having us here. The Adaptation Fund has pioneered and at this point has quite a solid experience with the direct access modality, whereby a country can access funds directly from the fund to manage adaptation project and requires, of course, an entity to be accredited. Concrete projects that helps vulnerable communities in developing countries adapt to climate change, and initiatives are based on country needs, views, and priorities, and this is very important. So now we have 25 national implementing entities in response to Gaia before, many to come. There are a number of entities, a number of applicants. Of these 25 national implementing entities, 40% are in the least developed countries and small island developing states. We also have 6 regional implementing entities and 12 multilateral implementing entities. Now, we have to say that we have done a number of workshops around to facilitate the process. But our intention here is to really try to put the accreditation process within a context. So the context is that the Adaptation Fund projects, regardless of whether they are implemented by national or international implementing entities, are always based on country priorities and existing country plans and strategies, including NDC and NAPs, or other adaptation-related or sectorial strategy. So going back to the question before, what, for example, a DA could do to facilitate an accreditation process, I can respond immediately. They could help on choosing the right entity through the internal dialogue that the Adaptation Fund can only facilitate. The other, so if we see the accreditation process has 2 main characteristics. On one side is an assessment, a risk assessment through very thorough accreditation criteria. On the other hand, we should never forget that the accreditation process is a very important capacity building exercise. So it is an evidence-based project, an evidence-based, process. And 4 of the main pillars are the legal status, which is the demonstration of a legal personality, the financial management and integrity, so through the internal control framework, the internal audit, the preparation of business plans and budget, and also the institutional capacity. So the project part, so the project implementation that goes from the project inception and the procurement up to the impact evaluation. And the 4th pillar is the transparency, self-investigative powers, anti-corruption measure, and the handling complaints about harmful environmental and social and gender impact of projects. So if we see, we were asked to, in the cases of small island development states, we were asked to provide 1 slide, and that's why we provide just 1 slide of trying to do this exercise with you, which is a typical case of an accreditation panel meeting where the panel experts are faced with different type of entity. So in a case, for example, of a small island, and that's why I'm trying to get you a bit more in what the accreditation challenges can be. So for example, in the small island state, what we saw some capacity gaps. So like, for example, there is less formal internal controls than those of larger entities that permit management to override the internal controls that do exist. And this may lead to an increased risk of fraud. So one of the mitigating factors was to consider an active board of directors or another oversight body which essentially regularly overview day-to-day operation, and having, for example, full documentation of key financial and operating processes and procedures to minimize the risk. So essentially, how to facilitate, so the moment there is an understanding on the context that the accreditation takes place in, which are mitigating factors that can facilitate this process. Other gaps is the limited segregation of duties in small islands. So in that case, could be considered an active management supervision of staff operations. Also, another is the limited ability to withstand adverse financial condition and still sustain operation. One of the mitigating factor is that, of course, the implementing entity will need in any case to demonstrate the financial sustainability in the short, medium, and long term. It is very important to understand that the Adaptation Fund, it's not financing startup. Because it's an evidence-based process, must have an evidence-based or at least 2 years of experience. Another gaps that we saw in the Pacific Islands was, for example, the turnover of key staff, or on the opposite, when there is the one-show man, so the complete reliance on key individuals. That could happen in small entities. So in this case, the entity will need to demonstrate the key staff can deliver, and they are fully staffed with qualified individuals, or we have training and a major board oversight. So this is the basis, for example, to have come up with a policy on a streamlined accreditation process. So far, the Adaptation Fund has 3 entities that have been accredited under the streamlined accreditation process, 2 of which are in the Pacific Island. It has been considered, of course, it is not, as you know, the cap for our funding is 10 million. In a case of a streamlined accreditation process is less, because it's, let's say, it's a risk mitigation measure. And this has been very much appreciated by the small entity. Now, because this is also one of the characteristics of the Adaptation Fund, to try to be essentially the facilitator in all of this process, is the interest in local actors. So they are essentially in the very center, which means essentially looking at the adaptation challenge at the very local, and including then the role of different local actors. And we are also very fond of the CCO participation. So what we are essentially trying to do with the entity is really trying to facilitate as much as possible the understanding through helping, again, as much as possible with the small secretariat that we have, the language barriers. We're also trying to facilitate as much as possible the ongoing communication. Let's say the accreditation process and the direct access modality is now to the point that we have reached the 5 years experience, and we are in a point that most of the organization, the entity that have been accredited in the first place, are now seeking reaccreditation. The direct access modality has actually reached a seniority of understanding. So right now, I would say is much easier to come up with a shorter time for accreditation and to include accreditation as a first step of a project implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia. I have to appreciate your comments. Whilst the focus has been on SIDS, some of the structural issues that you point out as limiting factors or challenges could also be shared with other non-SIDS countries. So it's very important also that you've underscored the importance of context in the case of accreditation, how the board has worked with states seeking accreditation to overcome some of the challenges.